When last we left off, we were talking about the if, and else blocks, which let us have a single decision with multiple options. And the big thing for us to remember there is that for each of those options, we're testing only one thing at once. The last exercise and last demonstration is that drinks menu, wherein the user would have at most one drink. What we're going to talk about right now is the idea of nested if statements, which is basically just if statements inside of other if statements. And the really cool thing that happens here with the nested if statements is that they give us a tool by which to test multiple things at once, which is to say that if we have a complex condition, something that requires a lot of things to be true in order for the whole thing to be true, we can use nested if statements are one tool that we can use. Okay? And so let us say that we want the user to give us a number that is an odd multiple of 3 between 10 and 30. So something like 15 or 21 or 27. Those are in fact the only those are the only options here. And so if any of these conditions are false, if any of these conditions aren't met, we reject the user's number. So let's say that that's what we want. Okay. One way that we can do this, we can start with this, right? So we can say it needs to be odd, it needs to be a multiple of 3, it needs to be between 10 and 30, so it needs to be greater than or equal to 10 and less than or equal to 30. So let's start by asking the user just for an odd number. That is, if our number, mod 2, is not equal to 0, or if it's equal to 1, either way, then we know that we have an odd number, and that's fine. And then from this, if we want to test to see if it's a multiple of 3, right? So if this is true, we print out good work. Now, if this is true, we can also stick another if statement in here. Wherein, if this is true, then we check to see if it's a multiple of 3. And if that's true, then we check to see if it's greater than or equal to 10. And if that's true, then we check to see if it's less than or equal to 30. Which is to say that whether or not however far we check depends entirely on whether or not the previous condition is true, right? So let's say we have an odd number, but it isn't a multiple of 3. Instead of checking these guys, we just skip down to the corresponding curly brace. That'll be this one right here, and then down to the end. Right. So that's how that ends up working. And with the program flow, this is to give you a better sense of what this looks like. So the first thing that we check is that if our number is odd, right? If it's true, if our number is in fact odd, we go and we do the stuff inside the curly brace, which is to say we move on to this next conditional. And if it's false, we skip down to that closing curly brace. And we skip everything else that's inside here. We just skip everything. Now let's say this is true. Then we check the second curly brace. Now if it ends up being true, we keep going. But if it's false, we skip down to the end and keep going from there. Down to the third if block. If this one is true, we keep going. If it's false, we skip down, and then we just keep going right past that. Then the last one. If this is true, we take it, and then we do this final output. And if it's false, we skip down to this curly brace, and we go all the way to the end. Okay, now this is some heady stuff here, in that it requires us to keep track of a lot of things. Okay, now let's see this in action. Okay, that'll be the big thing that we'll want to see. We'll want to see this in action. I'll talk real briefly after that about the else statements. Okay, so here's what we have so far. We've got a scanner, a class, our main method. We make a scanner. We do some printing. We ask the user for a number. Now, if our number is even, or if our number is odd, I'm sorry, then system.out.println odd number. And if our number is a multiple of 3, system.out.println multiple of 3. If our number is greater than 10, system.out.println greater than 10. And if our number is less than 30, we do some output. Okay, now again, like if we're only going to evaluate based on the way this works as far as these conditions keep being true, which is to say, like if this condition right here, if that one ends up being false, we've definitely evaluated that one already because it's already happened. But if this condition right here, if our number is not a multiple of 3 is false, we skip over all of the rest of this stuff. We don't even check to see if it's greater than 10 or if it is less than 30. We just skip all the way down to the end of the program. Okay, and we'll talk about how to do some output with error messages here in just a second. Right now, though, let's just see this in action. Okay, so we're going to save and quit. We'll compile. Let's see if we run into any errors. We don't, so that's good news. Okay, so we're going to ask for a number, and we know already, just from sort of experimentally, that 15, 21, and 27 are all numbers that we can take. So let's just take 27, for example. Okay, so it's an odd number, it's a multiple of 3, it's greater than 10, it's an odd multiple of 3 between 10 and 30. Good job, end of program. So that's good news. Okay, now let's take let's take a different number. Let's say we do 33, which is an odd multiple of 3 that's greater than 10, but it's not less than 30. So this isn't going to kick it. This is going to kick us out at some point. All right, so we'll give it a 33. So it's an odd number. It's a multiple of 3. It's greater than 10, but it's not less than 30. So we don't get the reward of the program saying good job. Okay. Now let's say that we pick something like 9, which is an odd number. It's a multiple of 3, but it is neither less than 10 nor is neither greater than 10, but it is less than 30, right? So the fact that it's less than 30 isn't going to matter. It's not going to matter even a tiny bit, right? And the reason that doesn't matter is because as soon as we get right here and that condition is false, we skip everything else and we go down to this corresponding closing curly brace. That's where we end up going. We don't we don't even worry about whether or not the number is less than 30. So that's a thing that we should probably that's a thing that we need to be aware of with nested if statements. In that, when we use them, once one of our nested if statements evaluates to false, we skip everything else that's inside of it. That's a thing that we need to be aware of as programmers and as people who do things with software. Right, so if you want all of these things to be checked, we have to use a different structure, and we'll talk about that in the next video. We'll have to use something like Boolean flags. One of the challenges of of nested if statements is knowing where to put your else statements and making sure that we use our curly braces correctly. And generally, there's some best practices. We'll talk about those here in a second. Let's first let's place our else statements real fast. Okay. So we're going to click off of that so it's no longer highlighted. Okay, now if our number is not a multiple of 2, then we know that our else statement has to go right after that closing curly brace, right? So if our number is not a multiple of 2, then we have to put our else statement right over here. Okay, so it would be else system.out.println not an odd number. Get some space in here. Close that out. And then the next one, right? So this next one coming up, this will be if our number is not a multiple of 3. So you can just go right here. Else system.out.println not a multiple of 3. I'll close out that else block. The next one, if our number is not greater than or equal to 10, then we have else system.out.println not greater than 10. We can close that curly brace. And then finally, if our number isn't less than 30, else system.out.println not less than 30. Let me close that. And so the thing that we have to remember is that our else or if statements go in sort of descending order. Our else statements go in the reverse order. They have to match, right? So we start with our innermost else, then our next innermost else, then our next innermost else, then our next innermost else, which is in this case the outer else, and so on. But we have to make sure that these all match correctly. Okay? And so this is, you can see how this is sort of a cumbersome system to work with. Right? There's a lot of stuff here. And you can see how easy it would be to make mistakes. I mean, the tool that we have at our disposal is just matching up these curly braces, but suppose we weren't using curly braces. It should be bad practice, but suppose we weren't. Or suppose that we were that we had so many layers deep that we couldn't even see this, or suppose that there was so much here that we couldn't even see everything on the screen. Right now it almost fills up the entire screen. Imagine what would happen if we had 5 more conditions, or if we did a lot more stuff between these conditions. That'd be intense, to say the least. So we're going to close this out, save and quit. The big thing to remember is just that each of these else's has to have its corresponding if match. And the way that we do that is by comparing the indentation levels and by matching up our curly braces. So this is why it's really important to use curly braces. We'll compile. Everything's good. We'll run. Let's give it the same numbers first. So we'll give it a 27, and that should be fine. So it's an odd number, it's a multiple of 3, it's greater than 10, it's not a multiple of 3 between 10 and 30, therefore, good job. Okay, so that one's good. And then let's give it let's give it 33. I think that was the second number that we did, where this is an odd number, it's a multiple of 3, and it's greater than 10, but it is not less than 30. Okay? Now let's try giving it 24, which is an even number, or not an odd number. We don't even get the other stuff. Like, we don't get the multiple of 3 greater than 10, less than 30. And this is because this is the very first condition that we check. This is that very, very first condition. Okay? How about we try something like 9, which is an odd number, it's a multiple of 3, but it isn't greater than 10. And we don't get anything about how it is less than or equal to 30. We don't get anything about that. Okay, now that's important for us to know as far as the if statements go, and that we only go as far as we have to. We don't check everything. And if you have a situation where you only need to go as far as you have to, great. If you have a situation where you need to make sure that everything gets checked, where you output everything, that means maybe you shouldn't be using nested if statements. Maybe you should be using something else, like, say, a Boolean flag system. With nested if statements, there are a couple of best practices that I'd like you to keep in mind. Thing one is to not go more than about 2 layers deep. And when I say more than 2 layers deep, what I mean is that ideally you're not going to have much more than right about that in terms of your if statements. When we have this many if statements all in a row, in this case we've got 4 all in a row, thing one is that it's hard to keep everything on the screen. Thing two is that it becomes really hard to keep track of everything. Now imagine if you had like 85 if statements, especially if you're indenting them all the way through like you did, where each one is nested inside the next one. That would be an absolute nightmare to keep track of on the screen. But there are going to be times, especially if you become a professional software developer, where you're going to need to check 85 things, or 100 things, or 500 things. And using nested if statements is not going to be the best way to do that. The next best practice with the nested if statements is to make sure that we're using all these curly braces. As when we use curly braces, they help us keep everything straight. They help us make sure that what we have on the screen is also the thing that we want. And generally, with your nested if statements, unless you absolutely need to, don't use this operation. Particularly if you end up having lots of things that you're checking where those things aren't necessarily related. If those things aren't directly related, that is to say, if you don't have a situation where all of those things need to be true in order for something to work, try not to use nested if statements. And even if you do have something where all of those things need to be true, there's a Boolean flag model which we can use instead, which is a lot simpler. And then finally, when you're using your nested if statements, try to do your least complicated checks first, or try to do either your most restrictive, that is to say the one that's going to knock out the most numbers, or the least complicated. In our case, we don't have much, none of those are terribly complicated, but sometimes when you're checking things, like the computations themselves will take a couple of minutes. And so usually you'll want to delay those computations until you absolutely know that they're necessary, instead of doing them right off. Alright, when we come back, we're going to talk about Boolean flags as an alternative to the nested if statements, and then we're going to roll from there. See you in a bit.